6 months ago, in a high-rise conference room overlooking Lake Geneva, the air smelled of cologne, money, and quiet condescension. Billionaire investors sipped imported coffee and smirked as Ibrahim Traoré, the quiet president of a forgotten African nation, laid out a bold $2.3 billion vision for his people. They didn't even pretend to care. One called his country not mature enough. Another chuckled about charity cases. And then, as the laughter echoed off the marble walls, Traoré smiled. Just once. Calm, controlled. Like a man who already knew something they didn't. Today, those same billionaires are standing in the scorching 40 degrees Celsius heat of the Sahel, waiting outside his office in dusty black sedans, praying for 5 minutes of his time. How did a single moment of humiliation ignite the greatest reversal of power in modern Africa? What happens when a leader refuses to bow to racism, control, and centuries of silence? This is a dramatized story inspired by real struggles faced by millions across the world. While the characters and events are fictional, the pain, pride, and power they represent are very real. Because sometimes truth doesn't need to be fact, it only needs to be felt. The elevator doors opened with a soft chime, silence, then a gentle whir of polished leather shoes stepping onto glass-polished marble. Geneva's early winter light streamed through floor-to-ceiling windows, casting reflections across the cavernous lobby of the Continental Finance Hall. Everything gleamed, from the chrome banisters to the fresh orchids perfectly arranged every morning by hands paid more than a Burkina Bay doctor earns in a month. This wasn't just a building, it was a cathedral of capital, and today it hosted the Africa Opportunity Summit, an event marketed as a bridge between global capital and emerging economies, but spoken of behind closed doors as something else entirely, a safari for billionaires. Inside the summit's grand chamber, a long oval table stood like an altar, carved from a single piece of Brazilian rosewood, surrounded by custom-made leather chairs worth more than the average African's annual income. The lights above were soft but calculated, designed to shine just enough on the speaker and a little too much on the hopeful ones. Around the table, 25 of the most powerful investment executives in the Western world, and not one of them was African. Their watches sparkled. Patek Philippe, Audemars Piguet, Rolex, of course. Timepieces designed not to tell time, but to announce status. Jean-Luc Marot, silver-haired, sharp-jawed, CEO of Artemis Capital, sat at the center, straight-backed, scanning his notes. His firm controlled $847 billion in assets, and today, like every other day, he was hunting. Africa, to him, was an undervalued stock. High risk, low resistance, high return. A soft laugh broke the low hum of conversation. Margaret Whitfield, head of Sterling Global, leaned toward her German counterpart, Klaus Hoffmann. "Let's just hope this one speaks English," she whispered. Klaus smirked. "Or at least knows what ROI means." They weren't trying to be cruel, not consciously. It wasn't hatred. It was expectation. This was how things worked. Africa pitched. The West approved. That's how it had always been, until he walked in. The doors opened again, this time slower, more deliberate. No entourage, no flashing cameras, no clattering of bodyguards, just one man. Ibrahim Traoré. He wore a dark indigo bubu, traditional West African tunic, with minimal embroidery, neatly pressed and utterly out of place among $1,000 Italian suits. His sandals were leather, handmade, his face unreadable. He walked calmly, not fast, not slow, as if he'd been in this room before, as if he belonged here, even though no one in the room believed he did. Heads turned slowly. One or two didn't bother. Jean-Luc glanced up, then immediately back down to his tablet. One eyebrow raised, almost imperceptibly. "Is this the guy?" he thought. Didn't expect him to come alone? No one offered a handshake. The moderator cleared his throat. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're pleased to welcome President Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso, here to present potential investment opportunities in his nation." Polite applause. The kind reserved for a waiter who brings your drink but doesn't speak your language. Traoré nodded once. He did not sit. Instead, he stood behind the chair reserved for him at the far end of the table, hands lightly clasped behind his back. His voice when he spoke was calm, level, with the kind of rhythm that made you lean in, even if you didn't want to. Thank you for this opportunity. Burkina Faso stands at a crossroads. We have abundant resources, a young population, and a strategic location to serve West Africa. But we are not here to ask for charity. We are here to offer partnership. A pause, eyes shifted. Klaus raised an eyebrow. Margaret didn't even look up from her iPad. And Jean-Luc? He watched silently, fingers steepled. Partnership, he mused. Cute. What none of them saw, what no one in that room understood, was that while they were calculating risks and potential ROI, Traoré had already made his move. The trap was already set. He didn't come here to convince them. He came to watch them disqualify themselves. And they were doing it perfectly. The silence in the room was not the respectful kind. It was the cold, distracted kind. The kind that fills corporate meetings when the person speaking has already been judged irrelevant. Ibrahim Traoré stood tall at the end of the marble table, his hands resting lightly behind his back, his eyes calmly scanning the room of men and women who had already decided who he was before he uttered a word. He began, not with numbers, but with context. Burkina Faso is young, he said. 60% of our population is under 30. We sit at the heart of West Africa, touching 6 borders. We are not just rich in gold and manganese. We are rich in potential. What we seek is not rescue. It is partnership, equitable, respectful, forward-looking. Somewhere to his right, a soft click echoed. Margaret Whitfield unlocking her phone, her fingernail tapping against the screen in quick succession. Across the table, Klaus Hoffmann leaned back and sipped his espresso, his expression blank, but his posture dripping with detachment. A few seats down, a junior investor checked his smartwatch discreetly under the table. Only Jean-Luc Marot maintained eye contact, but not with curiosity. His stare was analytical, amused, like a chess grandmaster watching a beginner attempt their first opening. Traoré continued. He spoke of a new agricultural corridor that could feed 3 nations, of underutilized solar fields that could power a region, of a fintech adoption rate that had already outpaced parts of Europe. He mentioned partnerships with African universities, a mobile developer program training 10,000 coders by the end of the year, and a logistics project with 3 landlocked neighbors that would reduce import costs by 40%. The numbers were precise. The logic was sound. The opportunity was real. But no one leaned forward. No one asked questions. It was like pitching into fog. Then came the moment. Margaret looked up just long enough to speak. Her voice was wrapped in politeness, but the sharpness was unmistakable. Mr. President, she said, we appreciate your optimism, but we must be realistic. When evaluating infrastructure, risk mitigation, and regulatory consistency, Burkina Faso simply doesn't meet global benchmarks yet. A few nods followed. Klaus added, and the lack of investment-grade credit ratings makes long-term capital deployment extremely difficult, especially in rural zones. Then Jean-Luc spoke. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't insult. What made it sting was how reasonable he sounded. Mr. President, he said with a slow, deliberate smile, I truly admire your passion. You clearly care deeply about your country. But let's be candid here, among professionals. Burkina Faso, while full of spirit, isn't mature enough for serious investment. Not yet. We're not in the business of hope. We're in the business of returns. And just like that, the room shifted. One by one, the others relaxed. Permission had been granted. Laughter, quiet but undeniable, rippled across the room like the first cracks on ice. Someone whispered something that made Klaus chuckle. Margaret smirked without looking up again. It wasn't loud, it wasn't violent, but it cut sharper than any shout ever could. Still standing, Traoré took in every reaction, slowly, one face at a time. The smirks, the stares, the dismissals. He said nothing. The room expected a response, a rebuttal, maybe even a defensive plea. Instead, he smiled. Not the tight, polite smile of diplomacy, not the bitter smile of someone swallowing pride. It was subtle, controlled, but undeniably real. It was the kind of smile that didn't ask for understanding. It dared you to question what you thought you understood. And it changed the room. For a second, just one, the laughter died. The smirks faded. Something about that smile unsettled them. It was as if a man on fire had walked through the room untouched, unbothered. He reached down, picked up the single folder he had brought, just a few sheets inside, and closed it without rush. No flurry, no signs of defeat. "I thank you for your honesty," he said, his tone perfectly calm. He bowed his head slightly, not out of submission, but as a form of silent punctuation. Then, without asking for further time or offering further pitch, he turned and walked to the door. No one moved to stop him. No one expected him to. That was their mistake. For a moment, no one knew what to say. The room, so quick to laugh just a minute ago, had fallen into an unnatural stillness. Ibrahim Traoré didn't rush, didn't flinch. He closed his folder slowly, the soft thwop of paper against leather oddly loud in the suddenly silent chamber. No aide stepped forward. No staffer gathered his materials. There weren't any. Just one man, one folder, and a room full of people who had just dismissed him as irrelevant. He didn't try to argue. He didn't make any final appeals. There was no last-minute attempt to salvage the moment. No desperation in his eyes. In fact, there was no trace of emotion at all, at least none that they could read. He simply tucked the folder under his arm and looked up one final time, letting his gaze sweep slowly across the room. He didn't need to speak. The pause said everything. One by one, eyes dropped, some out of discomfort, others out of boredom. But one or two, especially Jean-Luc Moreau's, lingered a second longer, as if trying to decode something they couldn't quite place, as if sensing, maybe too late, that they had missed something important. Traoré turned and walked toward the door. No one followed. There were no polite handshakes, no hollow compliments, no business cards slipped into palms. No promises of, "we'll be in touch." The usual theater of diplomacy had vanished. All that remained was the echo of his footsteps across polished marble and the vague discomfort of power brokers who had just laughed a little too soon. "Mr. President," Jean-Luc said, standing up suddenly, his voice cutting through the quiet, "surely we can continue this conversation. Perhaps over dinner." Traoré paused, his hand resting on the door handle, his back still turned. He replied, not with sarcasm, not with anger, but with the same even calm that had carried through every word he'd spoken. "You've made your position quite clear," he said. "I respect that. I hope you'll extend the same courtesy to mine." And with that, the door opened with a soft click and closed just as quietly behind him. Inside the room, no one spoke for several seconds. The investors sat frozen, some mid-sip of coffee, others with pens still in hand. The air felt heavier now, as though something important had just happened. But no one could quite name what. Margaret Whitfield broke the silence first, letting out a short, dismissive breath. "Well, that was dramatic," she said, forcing a chuckle. "Typical," Klaus Hoffman muttered. "They never want to hear the truth about their limitations." But Jean-Luc didn't say anything. He was still standing, still facing the closed door, a strange tightness in his chest. In 30 years of meetings with world leaders, he had seen every type: beggars, liars, bluffers, charmers. But he had never seen anyone walk out, on purpose, with dignity, without fear, without needing them. He had no idea why it unsettled him. Outside, the elevator doors closed behind Traoré, leaving the Golden Summit chamber behind. And down below, the streets of Geneva buzzed on. Business as usual. Cars passed, people walked, phones rang. But inside one man's mind, the next chapter had already begun. Not in Europe, not with these men, but back home, where real change was already moving, quietly beneath the surface. Because the summit had never been the goal. It had only ever been a stage. They thought he walked away in defeat, but he was walking into something far greater. Before the boardrooms, before the marble floors and designer suits, before the name Ibrahim Traoré meant anything beyond the narrow dirt paths of his village, there was only dust and dreams. He was born in a house with a tin roof that screamed under the midday sun and sang when the rain came down hard. The floors were earthen, the walls made of packed mud, and the door was a curtain made from old UNICEF sacks stitched together with patience and pride. The village didn't appear on most maps. A few hundred people, a single schoolhouse. No electricity except the hum of a generator on election days. His earliest memories were of wind and silence. The Harmattan winds would sweep through the land each December, carrying fine red dust that coated everything: skin, clothes, food, and even dreams. Children would play barefoot, darting between goats and chickens, while mothers stirred pots of millet porridge over open fires. But even in that simplicity, there were lessons being carved deep into him. His mother, Isaita, was not a woman of many words, but every word she did say, she said like it mattered. She carried herself with a grace that made people stop speaking when she entered a room. To outsiders, she was just a farmer's wife, but to those who lived there, she was the moral compass of the village. She taught her children with stories, not from books, but from gestures, glances, and quiet corrections. She taught Ibrahim that dirt on your hands was never shameful, but dirt on your name was. Respect doesn't come from money, she once told him, wiping sweat from his forehead as they carried buckets from the river. It comes from knowing who you are and not letting anyone tell you otherwise. His father, Yakuba, was a man of the land, literally and spiritually. He spoke to the soil as if it could hear. He knew every tree, every drought, every shift in the wind. He'd walk the fields at dawn, his machete hanging from his shoulder, and he'd speak of the land as though it was family. This ground remembers, he'd tell Ibrahim. It remembers what we plant. It remembers who we are. And one day it will ask what we gave back. In the evenings, after the work was done and the skies turned indigo, the family would sit under the stars. The air would be thick with the smell of dust, smoke, and something deeper: possibility. They would talk of dreams, though not in the way city people did. Dreams here were not of riches, but of dignity, of clean water, of paved roads, of being seen. And it was during one of those nights, lying on his back staring up at the endless stars, that Ibrahim first asked the question that would haunt him for years. Why do they say we need saving? He was no more than 10. His mother didn't answer right away. She simply looked at him, her expression unreadable. Because they've forgotten how to see us, she finally said. And because sometimes we forget too. That silence that followed was heavier than any dust storm. As he grew older, the question grew louder. Every foreign aid truck that came bearing sacks of rice stamped with foreign flags, every NGO banner written in a language no one in the village spoke, every camera crew that visited only to capture the image of hunger. It all fed the same quiet fire inside him. Who decided Africa was broken? Who gave them the right to define what saving meant? And most importantly, what if the people who claimed to save were the very ones holding the pen that wrote Africa's weakness? He didn't know it then, lying on the cracked earth under a blanket of stars. But the boy asking questions in the dark would one day become the man who'd answer them, in front of the entire world. By the time Ibrahim turned 16, the dusty innocence of village nights had been replaced by the thunder of distant gunfire. Burkina Faso was fracturing. Armed groups patrolled roads that used to lead to schoolyards. Checkpoints appeared where mango trees once stood. The country's map hadn't changed, but its soul had. Young men around him picked sides, some picked guns, others disappeared, into refugee camps, into militias, into silence. There were recruiters in marketplaces, in mosques, in schools. They offered purpose wrapped in rifles, identity measured in bullets. But Ibrahim chose the third path, the narrow one, the one that required nothing but faith and a backpack filled with books. His village thought him naive. His uncles told him war was the only language the world understood. But his mother, though afraid, said nothing to stop him. When he boarded the creaking bus toward the capital to study, she pressed a small notebook into his hand. On the first page, in her careful handwriting, she had written only 5 words: "A sharp mind cuts chains." University in Ouagadougou wasn't what he expected. The buildings were cracked, the power cut often, the internet unreliable. But the classrooms were alive. Ideas collided like weather fronts. Students argued in 3 languages at once: French, Mooré, and sometimes English, about revolution, development, injustice, identity. Ibrahim listened more than he spoke. There were days when gunfire echoed from the city's outskirts, when lectures were interrupted by sirens or political protests. But inside those concrete halls, he discovered a different kind of resistance. Professors who had studied in Dakar, Addis Ababa, even Accra, taught more than economics or history. They taught perspective. One, in particular, changed his life. Dr. Lamine Ouattara was a wiry man with a voice like gravel and a mind sharper than any scalpel. He didn't teach African history. He unpacked it, laid it bare like an open wound, and invited his students to ask why it hadn't healed. He introduced Ibrahim to Pan-Africanism, not as an ideology, but as an inheritance. Sankara, Nkrumah, Lumumba. Not names in a textbook, unfinished stories. Your problem, Dr. Ouattara once said in class, pacing like a lion before a hunt, isn't that Africa is poor. It's that you've let others define what poverty means. That line sank into Ibrahim's bones. He couldn't stop thinking about it. All his life, poverty had been described with the image of his village. The cracked earth, the tin roofs, the bare feet. But was that poverty, or was it just not Western? He began to see the trap, not in the hunger or the lack of power lines, but in the narrative. In the idea that Africa was a problem and solutions could only come from somewhere else. The real war wasn't just in the forests or deserts. It was in the framing of every conversation, every investment proposal, every international summit that called itself an opportunity while treating African leaders like children at a charity banquet. While others chased scholarships abroad, Ibrahim turned inward, across the continent. He traveled to Senegal, sat in open-air lectures in Ghana, visited energy cooperatives in Rwanda, joined hackathons in Nairobi. He met other students, thinkers, coders, and dreamers, young Africans who didn't want to escape the continent but rebuild it. Together, they argued late into the night about what a new Africa could look like. Not one stitched together by donors, but wired by its own hands. They called themselves the New Architects. Not a political movement, not a party, just an idea. A belief that Africa didn't lack brilliance, it lacked ownership of its brilliance. In a quiet cafe in Kampala, Ibrahim scribbled a line into his mother's notebook. Africa is not waiting to be saved. It is waiting to be left alone long enough to save itself. That sentence would later appear in speeches, on banners, in books. But at the time, it was just one student's attempt to reframe the question he had first asked under a village sky. He still heard the gunfire. The instability hadn't vanished. But now he saw the battle differently. Because sometimes the most powerful rebellion is not to fight louder, but to think deeper. When Ibrahim Traoré returned to Burkina Faso, there were no parades, no camera crews waiting at the airport. No one threw confetti or called him a hero. He returned quietly, just another passenger stepping off a dusty inner-city bus with a worn duffel and a head full of questions that still hadn't been answered. The capital was louder than he remembered, more chaotic. The city pulsed with noise. Horns, protests, sermons, laughter. But beneath it all, something else stirred. Hunger. Not just for food, but for something larger. For meaning. For possibility. Traoré didn't run for office. Not yet. He didn't launch a foundation. He didn't hold press conferences. He moved through the cracks, through libraries, co-working spaces, tech meetups, and underfunded university labs. He started building a network. Not of donors or diplomats, but of doers. Young Africans who had no interest in waiting to be discovered. He found them everywhere. A solar engineer who had designed a working panel system using scrap aluminum and motorcycle batteries. A data scientist who had mapped rural poverty using mobile top-up patterns. An agronomist who had developed a drought-resistant seed by reverse engineering abandoned research from a colonial-era archive. They weren't famous. They weren't polished. But they were brilliant, and more importantly, they were tired. Tired of conferences with no follow-up, partnerships with no equity, and futures that depended on someone else's approval. Together, they created what they called quiet projects. Small, local, almost invisible, but real. In the northern provinces, they installed micro-solar grids that lit up 3 villages once forgotten by national infrastructure. In the Central Highlands, they rolled out an SMS-based crop pricing system that helped farmers stop getting cheated by middlemen. In the capital, they hacked together Wi-Fi nodes from discarded routers and created the first low-income digital zone in the city. There were no billboards, no official logos, no ribbon cuttings, but word spread, slowly, quietly. Government officials ignored them at first. International agencies dismissed them as hobbyists. But the villagers remembered who brought the light. The farmers remembered who gave them fair prices. The students remembered who gave them internet fast enough to apply for scholarships without sitting all night at cybercafes. Traoré didn't care about headlines. He cared about momentum. He had seen what flashy aid projects looked like. Well-funded, foreign-led, and abandoned within 2 years. He didn't want visibility. He wanted durability. And he knew that if you built strong enough from within, the outside would eventually be forced to notice. He met with his growing team every week, sometimes in dusty classrooms, sometimes on rooftop gardens, sometimes under mango trees. No formal agenda. Just shared vision and clear rules. No dependency, no ego, no waiting. One evening, as the sun dropped behind the hills and cast gold over the clay rooftops, a volunteer asked him why they hadn't tried to get outside funding yet. Traoré looked at the team gathered around him, laughing, debating, building, and said simply, "Because we will not wait for permission to dream." That sentence would later be printed on walls, turned into hashtags, quoted in speeches. But in that moment, it was just truth, not ambition, not rebellion. Just a quiet promise from one man to his people that they would no longer ask to exist in someone else's future. They would build their own. 3 days before the Geneva summit, while Western investors polished their speeches and rehearsed their dismissals, a very different kind of meeting was taking place behind closed doors in the capital of Burkina Faso. The room was nothing special, just a high-ceilinged space on the 3rd floor of the presidential compound in Ouagadougou. No gold trim, no chandeliers, just concrete walls, a single ceiling fan, and a long wooden table marked by years of use. But what unfolded inside that room would shift the balance of economic power on an entire continent. President Ibrahim Traoré sat at the head of the table, sleeves rolled, stylus in hand, notebook open, no entourage, no military guard, just a laptop, a jug of cold hibiscus tea, and 5 of the most dangerous minds in modern Africa. Dangerous not because they had weapons, but because they had vision. To his left was Dr. Amara Okafor, a Nigerian systems engineer turned innovation strategist, founder of the Sahel Innovation Network. She had built solar grids in northern Nigeria that powered entire school districts and helped bring mobile banking to 2 million people previously unbanked. Across from her sat Kojo Mensah from Ghana, an agro-fintech expert whose smart cooperative model had increased regional food exports by 300% in just 2 years. Beside him, Lynette Wanjiru, a Kenyan telecom architect who had helped design East Africa's fastest-growing fiber-optic backbone. And next to her, Dr. Bekele Tesfaye, Ethiopia's leading cloud infrastructure designer, whose team had recently built a sovereign, secure server network designed entirely on open-source African code. None of them had ever been invited to Davos. None of them had waiting rooms lined with Western lobbyists. And none of them cared. Because they weren't here to be seen. They were here to build. Dr. Okafor tapped her tablet, projecting a map onto the wall, an interconnected web of energy corridors, fiber networks, agritech hubs, and fintech deployment zones stretching across 8 countries. Labels flashed: Accra, Kampala, Lagos, Nairobi, Ouagadougou. Lines linked them like arteries, not borders, lifelines. "This is Operation Yoda," she said. "Cross-sector, cross-border, entirely African-financed. Phase 1 touches 5 regions: power, data, agriculture, manufacturing, and financial access. And we're ready to deploy within 72 hours of your Geneva appearance." Kojo added, "We've finalized commitment agreements from over 60 private African partners, diaspora investors, sovereign co-ops, micro-cap collectives. Everyone's coming in as an equity stakeholder, not a lender. No colonial clauses, no IMF-style backdoors. and zero dependence on Western capital. There was no applause, no speeches, just the sound of highlighters across digital maps and the occasional click of keys. In this room, action mattered more than inspiration. President Traoré nodded. His gaze scanned the map, then the people around him. They were not idealists. They were implementers. These were Africans who had grown tired of pilot projects that never scaled, of development partnerships that mostly benefited boardrooms in New York or London. They weren't here to ask for a seat at someone else's table. They had built their own. "What about cross-border regulation?" he asked. Bekele smiled. "Already solved. We're using mutual smart contract protocols layered into our intra-African blockchain registry. Each node verifies regional compliance. It's boring, but it works." "And the funding buffers?" 10% in escrow, 15% in local currency hedges, all managed via our Continental FinTech Alliance, Lynette replied. "No hesitation, no theory, just systems, solutions." And for a moment, as the sun filtered through the louvered shutters and lit the edges of the table, Traoré allowed himself to feel something rare, hope with structure, not the vague kind peddled in speeches, but the tangible kind, backed by math, code, crops, and cables. He set his stylus down, folded his hands, and spoke slowly. "They will laugh in Geneva," he said. "They will say we are not ready, that we are poor, that we are unstable, that we are children." No one interrupted. But when they finish laughing, when they return home to their towers and terminals, the first construction drone will already be in the sky, the first cable laid, the first solar grid live, because we will not go to them for approval. He looked around the table, not for applause, but for alignment. We don't need the West, we need each other. And in that quiet war room in Ouagadougou, the first true battle for African economic sovereignty had already been won, without a single shot fired, without a single permission slip signed. The signing didn't happen in a gilded ballroom or a five-star conference center. There were no news cameras, no red carpet, no orchestras playing national anthems. It happened in a circular room tucked away in a modest government facility on the outskirts of Ouagadougou, where the power flickered every few hours, and the only air conditioning came from the wide-open windows. But that afternoon, something historic took place. Africa signed with itself. At the center of the room was a round table, deliberately round so no one would sit at the head. A single flag stood not for any one country, but for the Sahel region, symbolizing shared resources, shared destiny. A whiteboard in the background still bore the words someone had scrawled earlier that morning in blue marker. "No borders, just bridges." Dr. Amara Okafor was the first to speak. "Today is not about politics. It's not about headlines. It's about execution." She tapped her tablet, and the main dashboard of Operation Yoda lit up on the screen behind her. 5 pillars: fintech, solar energy, agrotech, AI applications, and distributed manufacturing. Each pillar connected to projects in multiple countries: solar corridors between Niger and Nigeria, AI-powered irrigation systems in Ghana, blockchain-based cross-border payment platforms linking Côte d'Ivoire and Kenya, and agro-processing centers in Mali and Togo. The total investment value was staggering, $2.3 billion US, but not a single dollar came from the World Bank, IMF, or any Western nation. Instead, the capital came from within. Half of it was raised through regional sovereign wealth funds, contributions from national treasuries in Ghana, Nigeria, Ethiopia, Rwanda, and Burkina Faso. The other half came from African private sector stakeholders, diaspora-backed angel investors, fintech unicorns from Nairobi, micro-lending cooperatives in Bamako, and even farming unions pooling capital through blockchain crowdfunding. There were no dominant shareholders, no majority controllers. Every contributor, from a pan-African telecom company to a women-led seed bank collective in Uganda, received an equity stake proportional and capped, ensuring shared ownership across the board. It wasn't just a funding model, it was a message. No single hand would own the steering wheel. Instead of profits being repatriated to foreign capitals, revenue would flow into local reinvestment pools, workforce development, and innovation grants for African youth. Technology licensing followed a simple rule: open source first, proprietary second. All data generated by these systems, agricultural yield, solar efficiency, digital transactions, would remain under African jurisdiction. As each delegation representative reviewed and signed the digital charter on their tablets, a quiet rhythm emerged. No one spoke, but the room pulsed with something electric, equal parts solemnity and pride. This wasn't a gesture. This was infrastructure. This was bandwidth. This was food. This was power, in every sense of the word. When it was Traoré's turn to sign, he didn't rush. He held the stylus for a moment before tapping his name into digital permanence. He had seen too many empty signatures in his lifetime, too many deals where handshakes came with handcuffs. This one felt different, not because it was ambitious, but because it was theirs. He looked up and met eyes with each representative across the table, not as a president speaking to partners, but as a peer among equals. "No one will clap for us," he said quietly. "No headlines will celebrate what we've done today. But when the grids light up, when the harvests triple, when children learn on systems we've built ourselves, we will know. And that will be enough." Kojo Mensah nodded, tapping his stylus against the table. "Let them ignore us," he said. "We're not building for attention. We're building for endurance." The room nodded. Quiet agreement. No signatures on paper, no golden seals, just fingerprints on glass and fire in their eyes. Outside, the call to prayer echoed faintly from a nearby mosque. Vendors pushed carts of grilled maize past potholes. Motorbikes weaved between traffic. Life carried on as usual. But inside that small room in Ouagadougou, Africa had just made itself a promise, one that no foreign contract could break. The final cappuccinos were being served in Geneva. Inside the gleaming walls of the Continental Finance Hall, the Africa Opportunity Summit rolled on without pause, without urgency, without a hint of awareness of what had just been set in motion 3,000 miles to the south. The air buzzed with idle conversation, the clink of cutlery against porcelain, and the comfortable confidence of power convinced of its permanence. "Burkina Faso?" one executive murmured between bites of smoked salmon. "Charming fellow, but not quite investment-grade material, is he?" Another laughed, swirling wine in a crystal glass. "They're always so passionate, but passion doesn't lay fiber optics." Laughter, agreement, a passing comment about upcoming deals in Egypt or South Africa. Places with real infrastructure. No one mentioned the quiet man who had walked out without raising his voice. No one thought of him again. At that exact moment, in a sun-beaten district on the outskirts of Ouagadougou, a different kind of sound was beginning. A low mechanical hum, a spark of ignition, then the deep industrial thrum of machinery roaring to life for the first time. On a barren plot of land just months earlier, covered in brush and rusted scrap, the first construction drones lifted off the ground, casting their shadows over the red earth. Cranes began rotating slowly. Foundation frames were lowered into pre-dug trenches. Power cells shipped from Senegal and assembled in Lagos were unboxed and installed by a crew of technicians from across the continent. Half of them under 30, none of them foreign-trained. A flatbed truck rumbled in, carrying dozens of solar panels wrapped in cloth bearing the logo of the Sahel Innovation Network. In the distance, you could hear the rhythmic click of fiber optic cables being pulled through underground tubing, marking the start of what would become Burkina Faso's first decentralized data grid, owned not by foreign telecom giants, but by a Pan-African digital consortium. In a mobile control center nearby, engineers monitored dashboards filled with blinking lights and startup protocols. Every metric they watched, latency, voltage flow, atmospheric load, represented more than data. It represented a beginning. Back in Geneva, Jean-Luc Marot was reviewing acquisition forecasts. He didn't notice the notification that flashed briefly across his international portfolio tracker. Burkina Faso, Infrastructure Index, up 12.3%. He clicked it away. In Ouagadougou, Traoré watched the work in silence from a rooftop 2 blocks away. He didn't need to stand on a stage. He didn't need to give orders. The machine had been set in motion long before Geneva. Now it simply ran, because people believed in it and in themselves. Behind him, Dr. Amara Okafor joined him, shielding her eyes from the sun. "You think they'll notice yet?" she asked, a half-smile playing on her lips. Traoré shook his head slowly. "Not today," he said, "but soon." She nodded, then looked out again at the scene unfolding below. Foundation poured, towers rising, cables stretching like veins across the dust. "They laughed," she said, almost to herself. "Laughed at the silence." Traoré's expression didn't change, but his voice was resolute. They laughed at the silence, but they missed the thunder underneath. And as the camera of history rolled on, Geneva went back to its polished deals, blind to what had just been born in the heat and dust of Ouagadougou, a movement no longer waiting for permission, no longer knocking on closed doors, but building its own entrance, brick by brick, kilobyte by kilobyte. The first thing Jean-Luc Marot noticed that morning was not the sunrise over Lake Geneva. It wasn't the quiet rustle of silk curtains or the faint aroma of his usual espresso. It was the buzzing, insistent, unrelenting of his phone. He blinked, groggy from last night's celebratory dinner with a Saudi energy fund, and reached over to silence the screen. But what he saw stopped his fingers mid-swipe. There were more than 40 unread messages, every one of them flagged urgent. His heart stuttered. He tapped the first headline. Burkina Faso declared Africa's new innovation hub, 2.3 billion development deal signed. He sat up, blinked again, clicked another link. No Western involvement in record-breaking intra-African investment package, and another. Africa's Renaissance. Burkina Faso leads revolutionary new model of development. For a man who'd spent 3 decades controlling narratives, Marot had never seen one spiral so far out of his grasp. He scrolled furiously now, his fingers jittering as one truth became horrifyingly clear. This wasn't a PR stunt. This was real. The deal was real. The infrastructure was real. The 2.3 billion, entirely African-funded, was already moving. He yanked his robe tighter and barked into his intercom. "Claude, get in here, now!" His assistant nearly collided with the doorframe. "Sir," Claude said, breathless, holding a tablet with trembling hands. This is all over the wire. Bloomberg, Reuters, even the Financial Times. They're calling it the most significant intra-African development pact in modern history." Marot snatched the device, eyes scanning the bullet points. Solar energy, fiber optic grids, smart agriculture, decentralized manufacturing, and, he stopped, digital currency interoperability zones. "No oversight from Brussels?" he asked sharply. "None," Claude replied. "They've bypassed European tech standards completely. All systems are open source, locally managed." Marot's lips thinned. "And the capital? No traceable Western equity?" Claude swallowed. "Zero, sir. They funded it with sovereign reserves, Pan-African fintech groups, diaspora equity pools, even farming cooperatives." For the first time in years, Jean-Luc Marot felt irrelevant. He stared out the window. Below, the streets of Geneva moved with polished predictability. Chauffeurs polishing Bentleys, hedge fund managers checking their watches. But somewhere else, in a place they had mocked just days ago, cranes were lifting, cables were humming, and a nation was becoming something the West had never expected. A center, not a subject, a center. "Get me a plane," Marot said quietly. Claude hesitated. "Sir?" "I said get me a plane. Today, Ouagadougou. Should I call ahead?" "No, just fly." Marot stood and walked slowly to the edge of the room, phone in hand. The news kept flooding in. Ghana announcing bilateral talks to replicate the Burkina Faso model. Nigeria signaling it may reroute infrastructure contracts. The African Union convening an emergency summit. His empire, carefully constructed over 30 years, was slipping, not from scandal, not from sabotage, but from invisibility. He had looked at Africa and seen lack. Traoré had looked at Africa and seen abundance. He had laughed at the silence. But now, too late, he was hearing the thunder underneath. The room was still. His espresso sat untouched. His watch ticked loudly, as if mocking him. The Geneva skyline remained unchanged. But somewhere in the Sahel, a story was being rewritten. And he wasn't the author anymore. The heat was oppressive. Even with the air conditioner in the back of the luxury sedan humming at full blast, Jean-Luc Moreau could feel the thick Sahel sun pressing through the tinted glass like a punishment. His tailored shirt clung uncomfortably to his back, and the seat, normally supple Italian leather, now felt like a slow oven. He checked his watch. 4 hours and 37 minutes. No call, no aid, no bottled water, no apology. Just a row of black vehicles, 7 in total, idling silently under the harsh light outside the presidential palace of Burkina Faso. Inside, one of them sat a man who had once dictated infrastructure policy for entire continents. Now he was waiting. "Has anyone come out?" Moreau asked, voice tight. Claude, seated in front beside the driver, shook his head. "Only a protocol officer. Said the president's schedule was full. No additional meetings." Moreau narrowed his eyes. "He knows we're here." "Yes, sir. That was made clear." Across the plaza, street vendors pushed carts selling grilled corn and mango slices. Children played soccer in the dust beside a construction site where scaffolding rose around what looked like a tech park or data center. Local workers moved with quiet efficiency. No expats, no Western consultants, just Burkinabe and their neighbors building something from the ground up. Moreau squinted. "What even is that?" Claude checked his tablet. "That's the new Regional Innovation Center, Phase 2 of Operation Yoda. Digital infrastructure, AI labs, data sovereignty protocols." "Sovereignty protocols?" "Yes, sir. Servers physically hosted in West Africa. No dependency on European cloud providers." Moreau looked away, annoyed, as if the words themselves were an affront. 5 years ago, the idea would have seemed laughable. Now it was being implemented, and without him. "Does he think ignoring us makes a point?" he muttered. At that moment, a junior protocol officer approached, knocking gently on Moreau's window. He rolled it down, hopeful. "Mr. Moreau," the young man said with a polite bow, "the president thanks you for your interest in Burkina Faso." "And," Moreau pressed, barely hiding his irritation, "he regrets that he cannot meet today. He is currently engaged in strategic infrastructure planning with our Ethiopian partners." "We've come a long way," Moreau snapped. 5 hours. "I'm prepared to offer new terms, significantly improved." The officer hesitated, then said calmly, "The president is no longer evaluating offers, sir. He's implementing solutions." Moreau's expression froze. Implementing, not negotiating, not asking, not waiting. The officer nodded respectfully and stepped away, leaving Moreau staring into the glare of a country that no longer needed validation. Inside the palace, Ibrahim Traoré stood beside a whiteboard scribbled with diagrams. Engineers from Addis Ababa pointed at a network map linking Dakar to Lagos, Abidjan to Niamey. The plan was ambitious: Africa's first intercontinental, sovereign-controlled digital spine, bypassing all external infrastructure. Dr. Kabedi, the lead architect, tapped the table. "We launch beta trials in 3 weeks, fully African servers, full redundancy, no off-continent dependencies." Traoré nodded slowly. "And the mobile layer?" "Encrypted, peer-to-peer, designed for unstable grid environments. We're stress testing with students in rural Mali next week." "Excellent," he said. "This isn't just tech, it's territory." From his window, he could see the distant glint of black cars in the parking lot. He said nothing. Dr. Kabedi smirked. "Isn't that the European investment envoy waiting down there?" Traoré didn't look away from the blueprint. "I believe so." "Will you meet them?" Traoré smiled faintly. "No need. They've already made their position clear. Now we're doing the same, with fiber, not words." Back in the car, Moreau finally leaned back, defeated, watching the children laugh as they played barefoot in the dust. He had once believed these lands had nothing to offer but risk. Now he realized they had just stopped offering anything to him. By the 5th hour, even the silence had texture. Not the tense, anticipatory silence of a pending negotiation, but something heavier, like the silence after a door has closed, not to be opened again. Jean-Luc Moreau sat perfectly still in the back of the idling Mercedes, his phone glowing dimly in his lap. The investment team around him had long since abandoned their confident murmurs. They no longer checked their watches. No one had spoken for nearly 20 minutes. Because by now, They all understood what was happening. They were being ignored. No, they were being dismissed. Quietly, completely, irrevocably. A knock on the window broke the stillness. A young officer, no more than 30, in a sharply pressed tan uniform and cap with the seal of Burkina Faso, stood outside with a polite, professional smile. Maro's assistant rolled the window down. "Mr. Maro," the officer said, with crisp but respectful diction, "the president asked me to thank you for your patience." There was a pause. Maro leaned forward, eyes searching the officer's face. "And?" The young man didn't flinch. "He regrets to inform you that his calendar is fully committed to existing partnerships." Maro's brow furrowed. "Perhaps a brief conversation tomorrow, then? I'm sure we can still—" The officer raised a hand gently, as if to soften the blow. "With respect, sir, we work with those who believe before the headlines." The words landed without malice, but they cut like glass. Maro opened his mouth, but nothing came out. Around him, his team sat motionless. Expensive suits, crisp white shirts, finely engineered watches, all looking in that moment like artifacts of a bygone world. The officer gave a respectful nod and stepped back. The window slid shut. The engine hummed on. It was Claude who whispered what everyone in the car already knew. They're not just rejecting the offer. They're rejecting the entire model. Maro didn't answer. His eyes stayed fixed on the palace doors that had never opened. Not even a crack. Once doors had rushed open for him. Presidents had rearranged entire schedules for the privilege of being in the same room. He had dictated terms to ministers, restructured economies, and left countries indebted for decades. But now, he was just a man in a car. Uninvited, unnecessary. Outside the car, a group of university students passed by, laughing as they pointed at the rising structure down the street, part of a new digital learning campus. One wore a shirt that read, "Africa Builds." They didn't even glance at the foreign convoy in the lot. Inside, Maro finally exhaled, and with it came the most foreign feeling of all. Irrelevance. This wasn't rage, not humiliation, not even shock. It was the realization that a door he had always assumed would be his to open never truly belonged to him at all. He sat back, the creak of the leather seat suddenly loud in the silence, and whispered to no one in particular, "I think the age of permission is over." 6 months after that silent exit in Geneva, the landscape of Burkina Faso had changed, not just politically, but physically. Where once stood dry fields and crumbling roads, now ran sleek tracks of polished steel, cutting through the countryside like a promise fulfilled. The Unity Express, a high-speed railway line, connected 5 major towns that had previously been isolated by rough terrain and crumbling infrastructure. At dawn, its engine would hum awake, sliding across the Sahel with a soft roar, ferrying farmers to markets, students to universities, and goods to borders, all under a flag no longer waiting to be validated. On the outskirts of Koudougou, children in bright uniforms lined up outside a brand-new public school. The building shimmered in the morning light, its solar-paneled roof feeding power to dozens of sleek classrooms equipped with high-speed fiber-optic internet. Inside, a young girl, barely 11, typed code into a tablet, grinning as her tiny robot rolled across the desk in response. Behind her, a wall bore bold painted letters in both French and Maori. "We do not wait to be led. We build to lead." Across the room, a teacher guided another group through an introduction to blockchain technology, how it could secure community land records without foreign intermediaries. This wasn't just education, it was empowerment, designed for a future Africa would define on its own terms. Further south in Bobo Dioulasso, drones buzzed above vibrant green fields, gliding over maize and millet plantations. Controlled by local farming cooperatives, they mapped crop health in real time, optimized irrigation patterns, and alerted farmers via mobile when pests were detected. Some of these drones had been designed and assembled right there, at the Burkina Tech Incubator, funded entirely by African partnerships signed under Operation Yoda. The results came fast. In less than a year, Burkina Faso recorded the highest GDP growth in West Africa. Mobile banking usage exploded to 78% of the adult population, a rate higher than parts of Southern Europe. Rural communities that had once been entirely cut off from digital services now conducted transactions, received weather alerts, and filed tax declarations from basic smartphones. But perhaps more remarkable than the statistics was the spirit that now flowed through the cities and villages like electricity itself. Markets buzzed not only with goods but with ideas. A group of teenage girls in Dedugu launched an AI-driven tool to help diagnose crop diseases. In Ouagadougou, young developers built a Swahili to Moore translation app to aid Pan-African communication. At the new National Data Center, over 200 engineers from 11 different African countries collaborated under one roof. No foreign consultants, no imposed frameworks, just shared vision and shared ownership. President Ibrahim Traoré remained visible, but not overbearing. He was often seen walking through project sites, talking with local engineers, meeting with mothers at school openings. When asked by a foreign reporter about the secret to such rapid transformation, he simply replied, "We stopped waiting for help and started building with those who never left." There were still challenges. Infrastructure gaps remained. Regional tensions brewed. The world economy was unpredictable. But in Burkina Faso, belief had taken root. Not belief in external saviors, but in internal capacity. On the platform of the Unity Express in Ziniare, a conductor blew his whistle as another sleek train arrived. Among the passengers, a group of Senegalese investors, a Rwandan education minister, and a Nigerian robotics team. They weren't there to observe. They were there to collaborate. Because the story of Burkina Faso was no longer just about recovery, it was about blueprints, replication, momentum, and it had only just begun. What began in Burkina Faso didn't stay in Burkina Faso. Like thunder rolling over a dry plain, the shock waves of its transformation echoed across the continent, stirring old hopes long buried under dependency, debt, and doubt. In Accra, Nairobi, Lagos, and Kigali, something fundamental had shifted, not just in policy, but in posture. No one wanted to miss the next train. Ghana was first. In a historic announcement from the Black Star Square, President Ama Bediako revealed the Kwame Innovation Initiative, a $1.5 billion partnership with Côte d'Ivoire in Senegal to create a pan-West African research and development corridor. The program would fund AI labs, green energy startups, and agricultural technology hubs, all backed by African sovereign wealth and diaspora contributions. Standing beneath the monument to Ghanaian independence, Bediako's voice rang out. "We are not inheriting colonial infrastructure. We are designing African futures." The crowd of thousands roared, waving flags not just of Ghana, but of a united West Africa. For many, it was the first time innovation didn't come with strings or apologies. Then came the Lagos-Kigali Corridor, a joint economic initiative between Nigeria and Rwanda, co-signed by President Okonkwo and President Uwimana. The project spanned fintech regulation, green shipping routes, and satellite-based education delivery systems. Crucially, it included a multi-billion-dollar African Digital Sovereignty Pact, effectively removing dependence on Western cloud providers. Western analysts laughed at first, calling it symbolic, idealistic, technically naive. Then the funding documents leaked, $3.1 billion, from African pension funds, intercontinental credit lines, and private tech consortiums based in Nairobi and Addis Ababa. There was no World Bank involvement, no IMF clauses, no foreign vetoes. The laughter stopped. At first, Washington and Brussels tried diplomacy, sending friendly envoys, think tank invitations, editorials praising African progress. But beneath the smiles was panic. These weren't isolated cases. This was a pattern, an ecosystem, a continent speaking in its own voice, no longer echoing borrowed scripts. In private meetings, the mood was far less polished. "How are we losing them?" a senior EU economic advisor asked, voice tense. "They're not being lost," his colleague replied. "They're just no longer waiting." Behind closed doors, G7 panels scrambled to devise strategies to re-engage Africa. PR firms were hired. Conferences were planned. But the foundation had cracked. For too long, the West had viewed Africa as a continent to manage, not one to partner with. Now African nations were managing themselves and thriving. At the World Economic Forum, a quiet joke began circulating among the African delegation. It went, "Remember when we used to apply for funding? Now they're applying for our attention." And it wasn't just rhetoric. Burkina Faso's model was being taught in business schools from Dakar to Dar es Salaam. Ministers quoted Ibrahim Traoré in parliamentary debates. Young entrepreneurs, once obsessed with Silicon Valley validation, now wore T-shirts that read, "Built for Africa, by Africa." Even the skeptical were beginning to believe. By the time the next African Union summit opened, more than 30 heads of state had requested consultation with the Burkina Faso development team. The message was clear. Africa wasn't rising, it was realigning. And the rest of the world had two choices: adapt or be left behind. The snow in Davos that year was thick and unsparing, but the cold couldn't reach the heat inside the main conference hall. Every seat was taken. Overflow rooms had been added. Reporters stood too deep at the back. No panel in recent memory had drawn such a crowd. The placard at the podium read, "The Rise of African Sovereignty and Global Development." At the center of it all stood a man who once walked silently out of a room where he was told he was irrelevant. Ibrahim Traoré. He wore no tie, just a crisp embroidered West African tunic, dark navy, with a gold-stitched collar. His expression, calm but commanding, was the same one he'd worn in Geneva. But something had changed, not in his posture, but in how the world looked at him, no longer as a curiosity, now as a leader. Traoré stepped to the microphone. The room fell silent, not from politeness, but from anticipation. 18 months ago, he began, I sat in a room very much like this one. A man looked me in the eye and told me my country was not ready for serious investment. His voice was calm. He wasn't here to gloat. The facts would speak for themselves. Today, Burkina Faso holds the highest GDP growth rate in West Africa. Our mobile banking penetration exceeds 78%. Our rural electrification, powered by African solar corridors, has doubled. And not a single one of those accomplishments was made by waiting for permission. Murmurs rolled through the audience. Some wrote notes furiously. Others just listened, eyes locked. In the back row, nearly hidden among the suits and security, sat Jean-Luc Moreau. He had bought his way into the panel, quietly, without entourage, without expectation. This time he wasn't speaking, he was learning. Traoré continued, his words measured, deliberate. Africa is not anti-West, he said, pausing just long enough. We are pro-Africa. That is not a rejection, it is an affirmation. We welcome all partners, but partnership requires equality. It requires trust, and it begins with listening. There was no applause yet. The room was too still, too moved. The weight of history hung between every word. The era of African nations competing for Western approval is over, Traoré said. We are no longer asking what we must do to be worthy. We are asking what we must build to be sovereign. And then softly, those who want to build with us are welcome. Those who wish to control us will find themselves increasingly irrelevant. Only then did the audience erupt. Sustained, thunderous applause echoed across the Swiss hall. Cameras flashed. Delegates stood, one by one. From Lagos to Nairobi to Johannesburg. From Brazil to India. Even some from France and Germany. In the back, Maro did not clap, but not out of resentment. His hands rested quietly in his lap, eyes still fixed forward. For the first time in his career, he was present but not central. A witness, not an architect. And in that quiet, something shifted inside him. He was no longer angry at Traoré. He was grateful. Because that day in Geneva, when he had laughed and Traoré had smiled back, he hadn't realized that he was standing at the edge of a new world. And Traoré was already walking into it. It began like a whisper, unease creeping through the corridors of Europe's most secure institutions. But by the spring of 2032, the whisper had become a roar. One by one, banks began to fall. Stock markets trembled, then crashed. Trillions evaporated from balance sheets like breath on a cold window pane. No one had expected it. Not so soon, not so violently. Frankfurt, London, Brussels, all paralyzed. The crisis, triggered by the long-ignored vulnerabilities of Western debt cycles, had ignited a firestorm. Private investment dried up overnight. Government bonds, once the bedrock of European economic confidence, were downgraded to junk. Major investment firms collapsed, including Artemis Capital, the behemoth once led by Jean-Luc Marot. By June, it was no longer just an economic crisis. It was existential. In a glass-walled war room deep beneath Brussels, the European Union's Emergency Finance Committee convened in panicked urgency. Phones buzzed, papers shuffled, eyes scanned screens filled with red arrows and downtrending graphs. On the table sat a single printed document, newly signed and stamped by the President of the European Commission. It was a formal request for financial rescue, not from the World Bank, not from the International Monetary Fund, but from the Continental Development Bank, headquartered in Ouagadougou. The request was simple but staggering: a $200 billion stabilization loan to prevent the systemic collapse of Europe's financial institutions. Terms negotiable. Response urgently required. 3 days later, the letter sat quietly on a broad wooden desk in a sunlit office overlooking the city of Ouagadougou. The skyline, once modest, now glimmered with innovation parks, tech towers, and solar-paneled skyscrapers. Outside, schoolchildren walked along smart paved streets, their tablets slung casually across their backs like books once were. Ibrahim Traoré, now in his early 50s, stood by the window with the letter in hand. He was older now, more seasoned, but still carried the same unshakable calm that once silenced a marble room in Geneva. He did not react. No smirk, no anger, no glee, just silence. The silence of a man who had long seen this moment coming, not out of vengeance, but out of vision. Behind him, his chief of staff, Samuel Ouedraogo, cleared his throat softly. "They're requesting a response within 48 hours, he said. "The board is prepared to review terms, but they're awaiting your lead." Traoré didn't turn around. His eyes scanned the horizon, solar farms blinking in the distance, automated metro lines humming between neighborhoods, children playing football beside a drone charging station. He gently placed the letter on his desk. "For decades," he said quietly, "we were told we were not mature enough to manage capital, to steer our own futures." A pause. He tapped the corner of the desk once, thoughtfully. "And now the same voices are asking to borrow from the institutions we built, with no help from them." Samuel didn't speak. The moment didn't require words. Outside the palace, the sun blazed overhead, casting golden light across the presidential gardens and the marble steps where press officers waited anxiously. Reporters already suspected something major was underway. Rumors swirled. Leaks spread. The global media had begun calling it the Great Financial Reversal. Traoré picked up the letter once more, holding it lightly as if weighing its symbolism more than its content. He did not smile. Instead, he sat down, calm, deliberate, and began to draft his response. The next morning, the press room at the Continental Development Bank in Ouagadougou was filled to capacity. Global media outlets jostled for position: CNN, BBC, Al Jazeera, France 24, and dozens of African and Pan-Asian news agencies, all tuned in for what was promised to be a pivotal announcement. At exactly 10 a.m., President Ibrahim Traoré entered the room. He did not carry notes. He didn't need them. He had lived this speech for years. Stepping up to the podium, he let the quiet hang a moment before speaking. "Yesterday," he began, "the Continental Development Bank received an official request from the European Union for emergency financing, $200 billion, to stabilize collapsing financial systems across their member states." A murmur rippled through the room. "We will approve the loan," Traoré said, calm and unwavering, "but not unconditionally." He paused, allowing his words to land. "Africa is no longer in the business of begging, nor are we in the business of revenge. We are in the business of rebuilding." A hush fell again. "This loan will be extended," he continued, "with 3 conditions." He held up one finger. "First, equality. The terms of this loan will not be dictated by fear or arrogance. We engage as partners, not subordinates." A second finger. "Second, transparency. Every transaction, every use of funds, every outcome, shared publicly, monitored jointly." A third, and finally, shared growth. A percentage of this loan will be invested into sustainable infrastructure projects that link African and European innovation, clean energy, digital education, agricultural technology. This is not only a bailout, it is a bridge. The room was still. The weight of his words and the grace behind them hung heavy. We lend, Traoré said quietly, not to dominate, but to uplift, even those who once doubted us. A moment of silence, then the applause erupted, not just from journalists, but from staffers, analysts, and African ministers seated at the sides of the room. It wasn't just approval, it was vindication. Across Europe, the reactions were immediate and stunned. Front pages hailed it as the great turnaround. Economists called it the most symbolically powerful act of the century. On social media, one phrase began trending in 21 countries. Africa saved Europe. At his desk in Geneva, Jean-Luc Marot watched the press conference replay with quiet reverence. He didn't reach for his phone. He didn't speak. All he did was whisper, almost inaudibly. It came full circle. And it had. The continent, once dismissed as not ready, had become the one holding the lifeline. But Traoré had offered more than money. He had offered dignity, wisdom, and something the West had long forgotten how to give: grace without submission. It had taken Jean-Luc Marot over a week to write the letter, not because he didn't know what to say, but because he finally understood the gravity of saying it. He had spent his life in polished rooms, behind polished words, spinning truths to suit markets. But this time, he wrote plainly. For once, there was no audience to impress, just a man he had misjudged, and a world he had misunderstood. The envelope bore no seal, just his name, signed in blue ink. Mr. President, I doubt you remember me, but I remember you. 7 years ago, I dismissed your vision, and in doing so, I dismissed your nation. I called Burkina Faso not mature enough. I believed myself wise. I was catastrophically wrong. Watching you lead the world with dignity, while I sat in silence, has been both humbling and illuminating. I write this not to seek favor, but to offer apology. You were right. I was wrong. He mailed the letter through diplomatic channels and didn't expect a response. In truth, he didn't deserve one. But one came. 1 week later, sealed with the emblem of the presidential palace of Burkina Faso, a single page, hand-signed. Mr. Marot, I remember our meeting, not for the insult, but for the clarity it gave me. Your words that day reminded me that Africa could not wait for the world to believe in us. We would have to believe in ourselves first. You were not my enemy. You were a mirror. And in that reflection, I saw the necessity of walking alone, so that others might one day walk beside us. I bear no resentment. We are all capable of growth. If ever you find yourself in Ouagadougou, my doors are open, not to revisit the past, but to imagine what might still be possible. Ibrahim Traoré. Marot read the letter again and again. He folded it slowly, not as an object of closure, but as a reminder that forgiveness is not weakness, and dignity is not pride. Sometimes the greatest strength isn't found in winning, but in letting go of the need to. The room was silent as Ibrahim Traoré stepped onto the stage in Oslo. Dressed in a simple, dignified traditional tunic, he approached the microphone with the quiet grace that had come to define him. The Nobel Committee chair's words echoed in the Grand Hall. For his vision of dignity-led development, for uniting a continent, and for proving that prosperity and peace can walk hand in hand, we present the Nobel Peace Prize to President Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso. The applause erupted, first a wave, then a thunder. It lasted 5 full minutes, not out of protocol, but out of awe. Traoré bowed his head gently, then began to speak. Peace, he said, is not simply the absence of war. It is the presence of dignity, of opportunity, of self-respect. When we treat each other as equals, not as assets or burdens, but as human beings with dreams, then and only then do we build true peace. In the last row of the packed auditorium sat Jean-Luc Marot, older now, eyes moist, face quiet. He didn't applaud to be seen. He simply stood and listened. Backstage, the noble ceremony had ended, but something more personal remained. In a quiet reception room draped in soft lights and silence, Marot and Traoré met for the second time. No podiums, no press. Just two men who had once stood on opposite sides of history. Mauro extended his hand. Traoré took it. "You didn't just change how I do business," Mauro said softly. "You changed how I live. You taught me that humility isn't surrender. It's wisdom." Traoré smiled, a familiar, mysterious smile, the same one from Geneva all those years ago, the one that had once unsettled a room of billionaires. "We all grow," he said. "The question is, into what?" They didn't speak long. They didn't need to. Some apologies had already been accepted without words, and some lessons, once learned, don't need repeating. As Mauro left the room, Traoré turned to the window. Snow was beginning to fall outside, dusting Oslo in white. The world was changing, and this time Africa had helped shape the storm and the shelter. They called it the Geneva Moment. It became a case study at Harvard, a documentary on the BBC, a global conversation starter, a symbol. Schools in Nairobi, Dakar, and Accra taught it not as history, but as possibility. At Oxford, the Traoré model was analyzed in development theory. At the African Union, it was cited in every strategic charter for the next decade. And perhaps most beautifully, children across Africa stopped dreaming of escape. They began dreaming of building. Girls in Burkina Faso learned coding in solar-powered schools. Boys in Rwanda studied green architecture. Entrepreneurs in Lagos spoke of capital raised from Kigali, not New York. It wasn't about isolation from the world. It was about integration on their own terms. In a modest office in Ouagadougou, surrounded by hand-drawn plans, data charts, and gifts from villages across Africa, sat Ibrahim Traoré. He reviewed school expansion reports, smiled at youth employment graphs, and sometimes paused to listen to the sounds of the city below. Still no gold watches, still no velvet chairs, just one man, one vision, and that same quiet smile. This story isn't just about Africa or investment. It's about what happens when people stop waiting for validation and start acting with vision. Ibrahim Traoré didn't retaliate with anger. He responded with a plan. That's what makes this story so powerful. It shows us that strength doesn't always roar. Sometimes it walks away with grace and comes back with results. From dusty villages to global stages, this journey reflects the rise of self-worth over dependence, of unity over division. It challenges the outdated belief that success must be granted from the outside. As someone who values growth and fairness, this story deeply resonates with me. It's a reminder that leadership built on integrity can change not just a country, but the entire narrative. Question for you. Have you ever been underestimated and instead of proving them wrong with words, chose to prove it with action? If this story touched you, don't let it stop here. Like, share, and subscribe to Captain of Truth, where every voice matters and every story echoes far beyond the screen. This story is a fictionalized and dramatized narrative created for educational, inspirational, and storytelling purposes. While it may be inspired by real public events, people, or societal issues, it includes imagined dialogue, reconstructed scenes, and character interpretations meant to highlight broader themes of justice, dignity, and resilience. Any resemblance to actual events or individuals beyond public knowledge is purely coincidental. We do not intend to defame, mislead, or harm, but to invite reflection and meaningful conversation. Thank you for watching Captain of Truth.